The first session of the day is titled Like Herding Cats, Managing Workflows and Complex Projects. In this session, managers from multiple organizations will talk about managing large-scale projects and training workers and volunteers at all levels about working in ArchivesSpace. Your first presenter is Sarah Ponichtera of Seton Hall University, presenting Coordinating Collection Renumbering Across Platforms when ArchivesSpace is the record of record. Sarah has been the Assistant Dean for Special Collections in the Gallery at Seton Hall University since 2018. Previously, she managed the Edward Blank Ivo Vilna Collections Project, a cooperative digitization project with the National Library of Lithuania. Next, Sheridan Sayles, also from Seton Hall University, will present using scaffolded learning as a model to incorporate graduate archival interns into creating and updating finding aids using ArchivesSpace. Sheridan is the Technical Services Archivist at Seton Hall University, where she collaborates with Sarah on processing priorities and protocols. Before coming to Seton Hall, she served as the Assistant Archivist at Trinity Church on Wall Street and the Archivist for Senator Frank Lautenberg papers at Rutgers University. Finally, Alexandra deGraffenreid of Penn State University will present on embedding standardized ArchivesSpace data requirements into processing workflows to facilitate large collaborative processing projects. Lexi is the interim co-head of collection services and processing archivist at Penn State University. She graduated with her MSI from the University of Michigan in 2015 and initially worked at History Factory before moving to Penn State in 2019. Again, we'll hold all questions until the end after all three presentations. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Sarah.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to speak with you guys today. So I'm going to be sharing our process for renumbering our collections, whose data is stored on many different platforms, when ArchivesSpace is our main repository for descriptive data. A little bit about Seton Hall, just to give you a perspective of where I'm speaking from. Seton Hall is a mid-sized Catholic university in northern New Jersey with about 10,000 students, 60% of whom are undergrads and about 40% are graduate students. The archives has historically primarily documented the main campus, although there have been tertiary campuses and still are for the law school and the medical school and a prep school that was associated with the university. But the archives more or less had its focus on what was happening on this main campus in South Orange, New Jersey. Although the school was founded in 1856, there were several fires that destroyed our early records. So our records are a bit incomplete. I'm just explaining this to contextualize what we were dealing with when we went to renumber our collections. Obviously, renumbering collections is not something you would ordinarily want to do in respect for the researchers who may have cited these collections. We obviously try to avoid renumbering projects like this, but in our case, there was a history of partial description, both because of these missing records and because of a culture in which, you know, the records would be organized on different departments around campus without a lot of information sharing. So the way they did it here was basically just creating a new collection number for each collection as it came into the archives. So this resulted in situations where, like, the records of the College of Arts and Sciences would be record group 5, but then the records of the Department of Plastics would be record group 27, you know, and no sign of the association between those collections. So as we started web archiving and email archiving and getting more materials from more departments around campus, we decided to create a more organized numbering system that would reflect the actual organization and administration of the university. So most of our time on this project was spent thinking through the best way of doing this and how to organize things and how to best reflect both the current structure of the institution and historic structures and build in flexibility for future evolutions that may come. But in this presentation, I'll just focus on our actual process of renumbering and how we managed it through all the different systems that we have. So, like, as you can see in the slide, like many archives and institutions, I'm sure, we have a number of different systems that describe our data. In fact, I didn't even fully grasp how many we have going until I made this list. So ArchivesSpace is the system of record for archival collection description. It's the successor system to Archivist Toolkit, which was used here prior to ArchivesSpace, and that was the successor to the paper finding aid system that they had before that. So we have a lot of legacy data there, and it is the primary system that we want researchers to refer to when they look for our materials. Our digitized collection materials, as well as our born digital collections, reside in Preservica. So this is acting for us as a kind of digital asset management system where it both preserves the master files and provides access to access copies of the materials. And we've set up the sync with ArchivesSpace so that the metadata from ArchivesSpace is inherited by the digital objects that are in Preservica. And this was a difficult thing to set up, but its value has really been shown during this process. We also have some materials in the institution's institutional repository, which is like, for those who aren't at universities, it's the system that is basically used to publish scholarship by the university. So it's not appropriate for all archival collections, but it is extremely visible and web optimized, search engine optimized, so that it's very findable. So it's great for collections that you really want to highlight, that you really want to get out there, not as appropriate for things that are more low profile or back end. So we also have social media crawls that are in Web Recorder, the web hosted version of Web Recorder, Carnifer, Web Recorder. We also have collections information in a working spreadsheet that we're using to track the locations of items as we're shifting our collections. So that is, although it's a tertiary system that's meant to be temporary, it's extremely important for us at this moment because we're actually shifting the materials, and so we need to know where they are. So that had emerged as an important point of description that we needed to keep in mind. We also have control files, of course, both physical and digital. And then finally, we have collections, descriptions, information that's cited in digital exhibits. So that's a lot to deal with, right? So we started with ArchivesSpace, of course, as the system of record. That was a two-phase process because, as I mentioned, we were reorganizing some of the collections. So we first renumbered the simple collections where it used to be record group 5 and now it's record group 7, and you can just do it very simply, and that's that. There were more complex situations where a number of previous collections would be merged into a single new collection number, so that was a second phase. Fortunately, this automatically updated the digital assets in Preservica because of the sync that we had set up. So that led us to focus on instituting as our next stage, updating the numbering for all of our digital assets. So in Preservica, we realized that we actually did have, even within the system of Preservica, 2 different locations that we had to update. There is a folder that syncs with ArchivesSpace, so that collection description was automatically updated. But we also have born digital materials, web archives, and emails that have not yet been synced to ArchivesSpace, and during the process of the sync, they're actually moved from their original folder to the synced folder. So we had to manually renumber the ones that were in this other folder. So that was a fairly straightforward process, and then we had to sort of deal with everything else. So the way that we thought was best to deal with this was to sort of divide them into categories. There were some materials, there were some locations of descriptive data that we used all the time, and we really needed to be accurate because we were interacting with them and we wanted things to be consistent between one system and another. So those were really the urgent ones. So those fell into the category of things like control files, which were often adding information to the control files. So those need to be updated. We had a project where we're working with our web archives. So those really had to be correct because we wanted those to be associated with the correct information, the correct collection in ArchivesSpace. So, and of course, that working document that I mentioned that we used to track locations, that had to be updated right away so that there was consistency between ArchivesSpace and those locations. The next category was things that were in flux that we were sort of in the middle of a longer term process with. So in our case, that was the physical boxes because we were shifting things. So we weren't in a big rush to renumber those right away because we were already going to touch them as part of a bigger plan. So we decided that we would renumber the physical boxes when we actually shifted them. Similar with the web archives and the social media archives that we had in Conifer. Those were more or less stable in their repository, and we were in a process of transferring them. So there was no need to rush ahead and renumber them in advance. We could renumber them as we were interacting with those locations as part of other processes. And then finally, the sort of last priority was things that were stable. So the stuff that was in the institutional repository, the stuff that was in the digital exhibits, those things are not going anywhere. They're not particularly urgent. We're going to leave those for last. So next slide, thanks. So this is the order that we recommend, that you start, of course, with ArchivesSpace as a system of record. You next decide on what are your most actively used locations that you need updated right away. Then the locations that are urgent that you're working with, but are part of a longer term process that can wait a little bit longer. And finally, the stable locations that don't really have to be updated at a particular time. So this was really a learning experience for us. I think it was a good process to go through, and it really showed the value of the syncing with Preservica that we set up. Because if anybody here has used that before, you know that it's a difficult process to set up. There's a lot of changes that take place both on the Preservica end and the ArchivesSpace end, and it makes the process of ingesting into Preservica a lot more complex. But this really showed the value of doing that because it made the biggest piece of the project, the update of the two main repositories of the descriptive data and the digital assets, completely streamlined and smooth. So it really showed the value of all that work we put in. So thanks very much. Without any further ado, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Sheridan Sayles, who will go into a different aspect of our work with ArchivesSpace.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
You can hear me? All right. Well, so thank you for that introduction, Sarah. And I'm going to talk about using scaffolded learning as a model to incorporate graduate students into creating and updating finding aids using ArchivesSpace and really just multiple projects in general. So Sarah did a good job of laying the foundation of what our, in general, work life looks at Seton Hall. And this is how I kind of play into that. As the technical services archivist, I work to coordinate processing and other projects as such. And just because of the kind of, well, I'll just delicately put it, the COVID influx of graduate students who need remote and hybrid experiences, I've kind of become an ad hoc internship coordinator. And it's been great as far as getting a lot of different types of work experience off the ground for many of these graduate students. But then the challenge comes how to incorporate what our existing workflows are. As Sarah said, we have a lot of different, not just physically shifting, but intellectually shifting projects incorporated. And how do we sync everyone in with this? And the main trick I learned is to use a scaffolding approach. So what is scaffolding? A little bit of background. I used to, or I still have my teaching certificate. It just might be out of date, but I learned this from teaching programs. And I use scaffolding as a tool to guide not just the internship design, but how I approach the different steps in questioning and developing skills for graduate archival students. Basically, the idea of scaffolding is that you will gradually introduce both ideas and agency to different learners as they go about whatever task they have at hand. So as the infographic shows, you can see the lowest level of this approach is to model the skill you are trying to accomplish, and then maybe shift from mostly teacher input, then to mostly student input, until your student can ultimately work on their own and be able to get done what they need to get done. And this works by both building off of students' experience and also just our understanding of what the overall task is at hand. So we basically take their existing knowledge and start to weave that into practice. I particularly love this approach because it both works to build confidence in the students so they can see, okay, now that we've learned from step one, I can begin to apply it. And they just generally understand better, not just what they're doing, but also why they do it. And a controlled introduction of content makes it a lot easier to see where they are at which step, and for lack of better way to put this, deal with small problems before they become big problems. It's been very helpful in getting everything off the ground. So what does this look like in archival internships? So I actually build scaffolding into the structure of internships by sketching out an entire work plan at the onset and essentially start from very simple concepts to much more difficult concepts. This sample matrix was done for a more advanced student who had done some previous archival work at different institutions, but ultimately just needed to understand how to work with a couple different types of materials. So this student had no audiovisual experience and little experience with objects. So we spent a little time talking about those particular skills before going into a more advanced project, essentially processing a small collection from beginning to end. Now, beyond just being able to break down these projects from small step to big step, I also try to work through complex ideas with students and use this modeling guideline to help make sense not just of what the task at hand is, but also how I translate it into a working environment. Many students have really only worked with these things in theory, so being able to understand this is the theory that I'm working with and this is how I connect it to practice is very insightful. So one example in which I would do this is in guiding an arrangement structure. So if I'm working with a student who is processing a small collection for the first time, we'll have a discussion about, okay, we have an organizational collection here. What does that tell you about how it should be described? And we're able to slowly build that assessment or that arrangement structure together before they are able to work on implementing that arrangement structure on their own. Additionally, if we have any complex trainings, I work to make the tools for doing that complex task widely available. As a result of COVID, we have had many of our students take their internships either mostly hybrid, mostly online, or fully online. So when processing, say, for example, email archives and building PST files and creating description for these PST files, we'll actually record the video training, make the recording available. So this way the student can work offsite and rewatch the video whatever time of day and just be able to see step by step what exactly is happening. And then finally, I just try to ask probing questions fairly often to not only correct steps as I see missteps happening, but also to break down a smaller decision I make and put it in context with the theory. So as an example, I might ask, do you know why I would want to put interleaving paper on the newspaper, but not on the rest of this collection? They can both tell me what they know about this existing preservation issue, and then I can just kind of work to fill in the gaps. And one other thing I do that I've also found very helpful, just because I have observed many students sometimes will get into the mindset of, oh my gosh, I'm so excited. This is my first archival internship. I can't mess this up. This is my career at hand. Just to kind of calm them down and make sure that we're making this an educational moment and not a grilling moment, I might ask a question like, oh, what does MPLP mean to you in the context of this digital collection? And then I'll add the note, this isn't a quiz, I just want to see what you know so we can clarify next steps. And that's been able to help kind of bring these students back to earth, and then they can say, all right, well, I know we need to have these sort of things linked, or whatever their answer may be. And then we'll be able to get a good quality next step from there. Now, the wonderful thing about working in ArchivesSpace is that it allows us a lot of different opportunities as far as not just teaching skills as a whole, but also how this particular system, that is the word I'm looking for, how this particular system can translate a lot of complex ideas. So as Sarah mentioned, we use ArchivesSpace as our primary content management system, and we use it in both gaining intellectual control of our materials. So when was this accessioned? How many linear feet are here? But also our physical control of the collections as well. We will link individual boxes and containers of different collections to their location within our vault. And being able to see both sides of that is very helpful in showing students that there's a lot of layers in making sure that we have control over our collections. So just some examples. At the start of the pandemic, when I had to fill in about a month of work, but still need quality control there, I worked to identify subject headings with the intern and basically introduce them to controlled vocabulary. It helped them think about what description needs to be included in order for a collection to be findable, and also think about the ways that our users are looking for materials. So we both keep within our standards of, say, Library of Congress, but also think about what are our users looking for and are we describing it accurately. I've also worked with interns to link accession records to finding aids. I'm currently working with someone on updating our radio station recordings, and to call this an artificial collection is being very nice to this artificial collection. So this has been very instrumental in helping me teach provenance and how we might kind of interlink both intellectual control of these materials and reflect provenance as much as possible. Writing notes, and even in some cases, whole finding aids, I found really depends on both the complexity of the project and how much time we have to work with a student. Two of our students are currently working on email archiving, so we are having them work on our scope and content note for that particular series, and also trying to reinforce with them, like, all right, well, how might be an appropriate way to look at this hybrid collection? We've got digital, we've got physical. Let's make sure that we represent all aspects of that with this collection. I have had a student in a very hybrid internship. This was in the fall. She only came in for one day, so she reprocessed a 1 linear foot collection. Very instrumental, was able to help with learning appraisal. And she was able to update this finding aid essentially from scratch. The original finding aid was bare bones at best, and she was able to add a lot more details to make this usable. And finally, in working with getting collections to a useful level of description, I've had students work on ingesting inventories. This is useful for both semi-processed collections and kind of consolidating different collections to make them usable. What has been very helpful in doing that is making sure they have a good background understanding of not just ArchivesSpace, but how ArchivesSpace thinks, air quotes. As Sarah mentioned, we are currently using a linked ingest process with ArchivesSpace and Preservica. And well, let's just say that if we update this too quickly, Preservica freaks out and it smells fear and just stops working. So we are currently still using the Harvard plugin to ingest CSV data into ArchivesSpace. And in trying to diagnose any issues that have come up with getting this data in, it's been super instrumental to make sure that we understand where these issues are coming from and being able to compare the spreadsheet itself with the back end of ArchivesSpace. Super helpful in trying to diagnose where these ingest issues may come. And as you can see from my infographic here, though I will initially support a student in creating an initial outline of a finding aid, we ultimately have multiple intern accounts that we use when these things happen so that they have the support and the initial structure they need, but then once they understand what they're doing, they can go forth and archive. And with that, I will give it to Lexi.
Thanks, Sheridan. Good afternoon, everyone. So the Pennsylvania State University is a public state-related land grant research university with campuses and facilities throughout Pennsylvania. Although Penn State has 19 Commonwealth campuses and 5 special mission campuses across the state, the Eberly Family Special Collections Library, where I work, serves as the university archives and the Special Collections Library for the University Park campus, which is the largest campus. At Penn State, Eberly Family Special Collections Library, we use ArchivesSpace to manage all archival description. We use ArchivesSpace in addition to the University Libraries Catalog, which houses all of our bibliographic description and MARC records for archives. However, all of our hierarchical archival description is done in ArchivesSpace. Currently, when publishing or republishing a finding aid, we export the ArchivesSpace description to EAD and convert it to an HTML finding aid. However, we do intend to move to a POI in the future. So currently we have over 2,700 resource records in ArchivesSpace, ranging from very basic minimal level finding aids to larger, much more complex descriptions. Because we manage all archival description in ArchivesSpace, it is important that archival description is created with an eye towards ultimately being in the system. We cannot create description separately and later reformat it to fit into ArchivesSpace, because this would duplicate a lot of work and require extra staff time and resources. It would just be too inefficient. So to work most effectively, and since all archival description is housed in ArchivesSpace, our local ArchivesSpace data standards must be incorporated into all aspects of the arrangement and description workflow. Next slide. At the same time, at times it's not always, next slide. It's not always archivists processing collections. We can have students and volunteers also working on archival description. We have to understand that students and volunteers will have a different relationship to ArchivesSpace than full-time staff members who routinely use the system and manage expectations and training appropriately. Staff members will necessarily have more in-depth knowledge, and their training will be scaffolded to better understand the system, as well as understanding our data needs. As necessary, they also have read-write access in order to facilitate their work. However, students and volunteers are very different. They require less formal training in ArchivesSpace because their relationship to it is more transient. They may only be mildly interested in ArchivesSpace out of curiosity, or frankly, not care at all. We typically do a walkthrough of ArchivesSpace as part of orientation and training, but we do not provide read-write access to students or volunteers. This means that students and volunteers do not have and are not expected to have an in-depth knowledge of ArchivesSpace when processing collection. However, their descriptions are still expected to meet both our minimum data standards and successfully work in ArchivesSpace. So in order to manage both our expectations for their understanding of ArchivesSpace and our data needs, we have to embed ArchivesSpace into our processing workflows, whether our staff, students, or volunteers specifically know that or not. Next slide, please. We start embedding ArchivesSpace into our processing workflows at the very beginning of training and working through using our processing manual. Pictured here is just a small screen grab of part of the table of contents from our processing manual. Our manual is incredibly long and detailed, beginning holistically with archival theory about arrangement, description, and critical archival theories, and moving more specifically to local standards. The manual is divided into 7 chapters with 7 additional appendices. Each chapter represents a different stage of archival processing. This manual is designed to be both a reference and teaching tool to train all staff, students, and volunteers on archival theory, our local practice, and our minimum data standards. It is also intended to be used for scaffolded training and application, similar to what Sheridan discussed earlier. At over 80 pages, the manual itself is incredibly long and overwhelming for most beginning learners. So to not overwhelm people or force everyone to read all 80 pages at once, the chapters are designed to be broken out and used individually as needed for training purposes. So this goes back to what I discussed earlier about expectations. Many volunteers and students want to know what they're supposed to do and don't necessarily care about the overview or long history of archival theory. Their eyes kind of glaze over. So it's good to have it available and to provide it in the overview, but it may not assist in training someone who will only ever be tackling 1 to 2 projects. This way, at each stage of processing and collection, we can hand a new staff member, student, or volunteer a chapter from the processing manual, reviewing and implementing that chapter slowly as needed. This way, we are both scaffolding learning and not overwhelming people who do not have training in an official archival background. The chapters of the processing manual highlighted, go back please, here include 3 areas: establishing an arrangement, appraising, stabilizing and restricting collection materials, and compiling archival description. These chapters all demonstrate how ArchivesSpace needs have been embedded into workflows. We use the language of ArchivesSpace throughout, including the titles of notes. The compiling archival description section details all of the locally required notes, how to compile them, and provides links to DACs in order to ensure compliance. Locally, we have minimum standards, which are slightly above DACs minimum, and we also control the language for several notes in ArchivesSpace for all collections, such as conditions governing access notes, conditions governing use notes, physical location, etc. Using the processing manual, we set that language and tie it directly to the ArchivesSpace notes. We also subtly format these sections like an ArchivesSpace resource record, moving from the most general to the most specific, and from the top of the resource record down as a staff member would scroll through that record. We hope that this provides an ease of use, both as a training document, but also as a reference tool for staff members moving through creating a resource record, or for students and volunteers compiling archival descriptions separately. Next slide, please. Another major way of embedding ArchivesSpace into workflows is through the inventory templates. We use the updated templates released in the last update, and almost always import archival object using the spreadsheets because we found this workflow to be much more efficient and allows those without edit access to compile description. However, as a whole, we found the full inventory template is very overwhelming for everyone. So in order to accommodate, we've created abbreviated import templates for donors, staff, and student or volunteer workers by deleting lesser used or unnecessary columns depending on the processor's experience level and complexity of the collection. Each template is mildly different, with the donor template requiring the absolute least amount of information and the staff template being far more robust. This also helps us structure workflow and scaffold learning. We can start with the most basic template containing only the minimum required elements requiring data inputs, such as structured fields such as EADID or publish, left off of the template to be added later by the archivist in order to minimize student confusion. Because the import spreadsheet is so flexible, we can add or remove optional columns as needed, minimizing student or volunteer confusion and adjusting to our projects as needed. We also use sample templates in training and as reference documents, which helps with alleviating people feeling overwhelmed or frightened by the spreadsheet. So using the import template is incredibly helpful. It ensures that when students and volunteers are giving us their description, it follows data standards which can be easily imported into ArchivesSpace and processed without much additional archivist intervention or data cleanup. By standardizing the use of templates and having instructions which dictate how to complete them, this ensures that even lesser trained personnel will have description which is consistent and understandable to the system. So in order to demonstrate how ArchivesSpace has become embedded in our processes, I have 2 short case studies, one for a volunteer and the other for a student. Next slide. The first case study is the William T. Sanders papers. These papers document Dr. Sanders' archaeological work in the Mesoamerican basin. These papers were received in 2008 and had been completely unprocessed for 10 years. In the summer of 2018, right as we had prioritized this collection for processing, we were approached by a Penn State faculty member about processing the materials himself because he was one of Dr. Sanders' proteges and needed the materials for his own research. So we ultimately decided to process the collection together with the faculty member as a volunteer and subject matter expert. And this involved the archivist, me, working to appraise and physically arrange the materials with our volunteer, identifying information, inventorying the collection, helping create the intellectual arrangement, and providing guidance for collection description. This project required very little ArchivesSpace orientation. The faculty member was a busy tenured faculty member and frankly didn't care about ArchivesSpace and only cared that the papers would eventually be described in the end. So for him, we wanted to guide him towards the description being available in ArchivesSpace without necessarily having in-depth understanding. So for this, we provided the volunteer with the chapter from the processing manual about compiling inventories, as well as the staff inventory template. In this case, we provided the more in-depth staff template because of the complexity of the materials and because he was able to grasp the inventory very quickly. As the archivist, I then compiled the remainder of the description, including scope and content notes, abstracts, etc. This project was a great example of embedding ArchivesSpace into our workflows. So we were able to appraise, read, arrange, and describe over 100 linear feet of material together while not necessarily working at the same time or in the same room at all times. So at the end of the project, the volunteer provided an inventory which could have been successfully imported into ArchivesSpace after only a spell check. Despite not having any real understanding of ArchivesSpace, using the template and our processing manual chapter, the volunteer was able to compile an inventory which worked perfectly for our ArchivesSpace data needs with minimal further archivist intervention. So it was a great way and was really successful for this project. Next slide, please. Secondly, I'd like to look at a student project. The American Sociological Association records is completely unprocessed and is approximately 300 linear feet and was not a high priority for any formal processing. However, a Penn State faculty member had been asking about the records. So in 2018, we took a look and realized that this collection was undescribed at the box level and had no description beyond the collection level, despite being over 300 linear feet. So in order to facilitate some research despite staffing shortages, we assigned a student to complete a high-level inventory of the collection. So again, this student, because they're an undergraduate student, did not have read-write access to ArchivesSpace and only had a cursory understanding of the system. For this project, we only provided the student with the chapter on inventorying collections in orientation and the most basic inventory template, asking just for the title, date, and box number for the materials. The remainder of the controlled required columns, like EADID, would be later input by the archivist to clear up any confusion. This minimal template allowed for speed. Although the project was interrupted for the pandemic and is not complete, we did have over 100 boxes completed by the student. So we were able to process the partial template for ArchivesSpace in order to facilitate reference requests. The success of the students being able to easily grasp and adapt the minimal spreadsheet has actually enabled other student projects. It served as a learning opportunity for us about training students on these templates. And as a result, we expanded the student template to include more columns for other projects. So again, to wrap up, using the processing manual and the import templates to standardize workflows embeds ArchivesSpace data needs into our processing workflows, allowing us to efficiently compile documentation for ArchivesSpace for people with and without in-depth ArchivesSpace knowledge. This allows for a lot of flexibility for standardizing description outputs, as well as structuring training and allowing for flexibility depending on project needs. That way, we are thinking about our endpoint, described in ArchivesSpace at every stage of arranging and describing collections and having a successful finding aid at the end. So embedding it in ArchivesSpace into our workflows has been a process, but by utilizing tools like processing manuals and standardized templates, it becomes far easier for ArchivesSpace to just become part of our daily work. So thanks so much, and I'm open. I think we're all open for questions.
All right. Thank you so much. If you want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen, I can share mine.
You got it.
All right, thanks. All right, yeah, and so we're going to go ahead and open up the floor to questions. So if you do have a question for any of those presentations, they were great. Thanks. I have a lot of questions, but I'm not going to ask them because I know attendees will have questions. Please go ahead and drop those into the Q&A option. We do have several questions already in. I'm just going to go ahead and dive in. So the first question is for Sheridan, I think. So are you able to share those training recordings with other students, or for privacy reasons, do you find yourself re-recording similar trainings for multiple students over time?
So at this point, most of our trainings are very project specific. So one example is we ourselves had to figure out an exact workflow, not just for ingesting emails into Preservica, but also how we wanted to describe those as well. So at this point, we haven't had to reuse anything. And generally for most like standard level things, like how do we process and what is our description level? I have a kind of script ready, so I'm not in my case like trying to pull things together, or I have templates that I have pre-made, so a student can just look at that and then go to town, for lack of a better term. But for the most part, our trainings have been pretty individual, so it just hasn't made sense at this point to reuse them beyond the initial group of students.
Thanks, Sheridan. All right. I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to ask Sheridan as a follow-up to that question. Do you, as you think of a post-COVID world, what sort of lessons learned have you taken away? Maybe you will create standardized videos that you can pass out to students so that you don't have to recreate so much work, or do you see this really as a stopgap measure just to get you through COVID?
I mean, I think we are definitely going to continue offering remote internships post-COVID. I think it will just primarily depend on to what extent we have digital assets available. Sarah can attest to this as well, in that we just have a lot of backlog of physical materials. So that's been at least my priority at this point. So the short answer is yes, I will gladly consider it as we have more relevant internships that would require that. But right now I'll save that. But one thing that has carried over with just thinking about translating physical internships to digital internships is a lot of my personal teaching style involves like little check-ins, like, oh, I found something weird while processing this collection. Do you want to see it? And that really can't happen in a digital environment. For example, I have a student who's working in a different time zone. So she probably can't check in on my little thing because she's sleeping or something. So I'll just generally make notes throughout the day of like, oh, this was a cool lesson learned, or oh, this was a weird thing. And we actually have scheduled check-ins for these students, so I can still pass on the same general lessons learned. They're always welcome to email me at any time, just still maintain that open level of communication, but having a scheduled time like, okay, this is our open time. We can even do resume reviews if this is where you're at this point. That's been a truly helpful standard to maintain, and I will definitely continue that in the future.
Thanks. We've gotten a lot of questions in both the chat and the Q&A asking Lexi for her processing manual. And Lexi has said that she's happy to email a PDF. She did drop her email into the chat. Lexi, I hope you're prepared for a lot of emails. But so if you would like to see a copy of Penn State's processing manual, she did put her email into the chat. You can contact her for that. Marcella asks, I think this one was for Lexi too. Do your staff and students / volunteers have electronic access to the processing manual? Does this help particularly the students and volunteers navigate to just the information they need?
Yes, so all of our staff members have access to the team SharePoint site. So the processing manual is there. I also encourage people to put it on their desktops so that they can just use it as a reference tool without having to search for it. For the students and volunteers we've emailed the processing manual, and then or sometimes we just email the chapters. So I will export, I have each chapter exported from the main PDF. And then I just email the chapter to them when they need it. And then when we are actually on site, I also print that chapter out and give it to them so that we can walk through it. So yes.
Thanks. And then I think this one was also for Lexi. Do you have statistics on average processing time per linear foot?
So we are gathering that information. I don't have that currently in the processing manual. We use the University of California extensible, what they have in their processing manual as far as estimating time per linear foot for each processing level. But I've only been around since 2018. So we've only been formally collecting those statistics since late 2018. And then of course the pandemic has thrown everything off. So it's a work process.
Thank you. All right, and then Lexi, we have several questions. They all are sort of related to how you get your spreadsheet or your template that people are using for data entry into ArchivesSpace. So someone's asking, do you use that for import into ArchivesSpace? And then Lindy is asking, for those templates, you said you completely delete fields and it looks like you also rearrange them. Do you need to make changes before you upload, or does it work okay with columns missing? So maybe you can just talk about that import process a little.
Yeah, so the import template, and we can let Jessica also talk about this, is the one provided in the last update. So we use the spreadsheet importer tool in our resource records so that we then, I got those from the last update. I downloaded them from ArchivesSpace. So ArchivesSpace provided them with the last update, and I don't remember where they're posted. The only fields that are absolutely required in the template are highlighted in red in the row that says "Do not delete this row," right? So for any of the other columns, they're completely optional, and you don't have to have them in the template when you're uploading. So that allows a lot of flexibility in ArchivesSpace's end for what you can add, delete, or not add, but what you can delete columns wise for uploading. Some of those require columns like EAD ID, which make no sense to undergraduate students. We just hide and then fill it in right before we import. So the donor template just uses only those minimum required fields plus a box number. Everything else all those other columns, of which there are many, 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 we just kind of delete the ones we are not going to use or are not likely to use in order to make things more simple.
Thanks, Lexi. Yeah, I'm going to drop into the chat the link to our webpage, the Migration Tools and Data Mapping webpage. The spreadsheet is available there. It's listed as importing archival objects as CSV and Excel or something like that, but it's linked there. Like Lexi mentioned, that's available if you're using ArchivesSpace version 2.8 or early or later. That is out of the box in ArchivesSpace. If not, I think someone's already mentioned, I think Seton Hall may still be using it as a plugin, as the Harvard import tool. It's a separate plugin if you're using anything earlier than version 2.8. But the spreadsheet is available there in that link that I just dropped into the chat. All right, another question. Hello from Georgia. Hey, Sarah from Georgia. How do you all keep track of processing work that has been done previously, both on and off ArchivesSpace? I'm thinking specifically about a record of the processing of collections themselves so that anyone can pick up where someone left off. Is this record accessible widely across your department or organization? Thanks for sharing.
So I'll start and then let Sheridan continue. Part of what I've implemented is processing notes and processing plans. So at the end of the project, it's part of our workflow to print the approved processing plan and the processing notes in the collection file. Separately, we have a spreadsheet for recording processing and where it is in the pipeline. So it has the collection title, the processor information, whether the processor is staff, faculty, student, volunteer, the date started, the date the processing plan was approved, and the total hours spent on the collection, as well as the processing level. So is it a collection level, a series level, file level, item level? So we're still thinking through how we might be able to do that in ArchivesSpace, but currently it's not in ArchivesSpace. But the goal is to make all of our processing workflows as transparent as possible to both our current staff members and also any future staff members, which is why we put things into the collection file.
Okay, mic's on. So all of us on the Seton Hall end are just generally taking notes as far as staff members who are processing and just keeping track of what's going on. I know one thing that I've actually implemented, because we've had a tradition at Seton Hall of having unprocessed collections be used by researchers. I've developed a couple forms that show if anything was weeded, why it was weeded. And it's just basically like a checkoff form of like, this was the initial accession as far as number of boxes. This was the completed section as far as boxes. And then just if things were weeded, what were they comprised of? Was it duplicates? Was it operating manuals of equipment that is outdated? And just generally have like a rough list of things that have gone, been taken away, and all of that good things. And for the most part, just because we are such a small shop, all of our people who are processing are basically on the ball. And what's been really able to help with our student interns who are doing processing is I make a point to design either very small processing projects or maybe a sample of a larger processing project, so that if a student either has like a family emergency and can't finish, it's not going to be terribly difficult to pick back up. Like I said, I've had students this semester work on processing small collections of like 8 linear feet for an entire semester, or working with email archiving, just something small enough that we're able to walk through each of the stages and I'm like informed at each of the stages. And then we also show how once things are done towards the end of the internship, how to document every single thing within ArchivesSpace. So not just the content of the collection are clear, but the labor behind all the collections are clear.
Thanks. All right, Catherine asks, what type of student are you working with? Are they studying archival theory or humanities subjects? What sort of student interns with you?
So at this point, almost all of the students that I'm working with are in their capstone internship experience for their Master of Library Sciences program. Well, at Seton Hall, we do have a museum studies department, but very fortunately, there is a collaborative environment with us between our gallery museum workers and our archival workers. So if there's an internship interest there, they would go to our gallery people. So at this point, it is just library science students. And this semester, I am working with interns at 5 different universities.
So most of our students are undergrads, and they come from a variety of backgrounds. We don't have a library science school on campus, and we don't require that special collections student workers have a humanities background. So some of our students are even like computer science majors. We have had 2 graduate student workers who are currently in archival programs, and they get a bit more nurturing because about ArchivesSpace, because we understand that they are training to become archivists and need more training in ArchivesSpace. So they get more thorough training. Right now, we have a graduate student who I'm not in charge of, but is working on some processing projects as well as some assessment work. And he does have read-write access to ArchivesSpace so that he can be more thoroughly trained on ArchivesSpace like a staff member would be, because we understand that his intention is to continue working in archives.
Thanks. Ken, I'm going to skip your question and go to Jen's because it sort of flows. So for Lexi, so have you ever encountered a student or volunteer who was interested in a deeper understanding of ArchivesSpace, and how did you nurture that?
So for them, we've only had 2 so far, but they get much more about the theory and practice of archives embedded into their projects. Also, I mentioned the current one does have read-write access to ArchivesSpace. They're also doing some assessment of some of our finding aids as well. We also have him engaged in helping us to write a new style guide to make for more inclusive archival description, which involves him actively reading a lot of critical archival theory, as well as other things as part of his internship. So it's just a little bit different because he's going to work in archives full time.
Thanks. All right. Kenton asks to any of you, are any of you using the methods outlined in your presentations to encode legacy finding aids into EAD?
All of our legacy finding aids were already in ArchivesSpace before I got there. So that it's not, we're beyond that.
Yes, and at Seton Hall, we started at Archivist Toolkit and then migrated to ArchivesSpace. So most of our legacy finding aids that existed in any digital form were already just set to go in ArchivesSpace. But that being said, as I mentioned, we do use the Harvard plugin, and sometimes it doesn't like the way CSVs are read. And so we have used Oxygen to kind of fact check, see where we're missing a caret or what have you, and just make sure our coding's correct.
Thanks. All right, we have one more question, and we still have a few minutes. So if anyone has any last minute questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A now. But someone has a question for Lexi specifically. Can you speak to why you've decided to maintain such a large manual? And that's a huge undertaking, so it's a good question. Yeah.
So I'll start with a little background. I'm the first full-time processing archivist that Penn State has had. And most of our staff members are not trained archivists. Penn State has a faculty staff system. So faculty members come in with the more archival background, but staff are not required to have an MLIS. So many of them have been working in archives, but don't have the formal theoretical backing of archives. When we started writing the processing manual in 2018, we wanted a firm grounding on theory, both as a training tool, also to provide people with resources for should they want to study more, as well as because there weren't standardized practices. Some of our description is all over the place, so it was kind of about sculpting description so that we could bring in more standardization. Because collection services has not been very visible in the department previously, because a lot of the focus is has been on research services or curatorial services. Part of being so detailed about the work that collection services does in processing collections was about raising the visibility of archival labor so that we can advocate for ourselves as well as our workers. We also wanted to be very detailed about the work that people are supposed to be doing and the specifications that we are using. We wanted it to be clear and easy to use as a reference tool. So we needed to go into a bit more detail. We also wanted to link out to DACs. Our appendices are actually just copies of the different forms that we use. One of our appendices is a reference list for all types of archival theory. So we wanted the document to exist beyond us, both as a theoretical, so we wanted it as a theoretical document for why we do the work we are doing in the way that we are doing it. Caitlin Rizzo, who just left us, who was the head of collection services, and I wanted to bring in a more critical lens for why we should reprocess some of our collections with an eye towards more inclusive description and more reparative work. So we use the processing manual as an advocacy document internally. We use it as a reference document, which is why it's broken out into chapters that are pretty clear. So each chapter might itself be 10 pages, but that chapter, like compiling archival description, is all you need to know about the minimum DAC standards and the minimum local standards and how to compile those notes and what they should be. When you think about it, and when we were shocked at how long the manual ended up being, and we actually cut out a lot. It's just that there are a lot of pieces to processing and there are a lot of pieces to archival description. And we wanted to be able to provide it in a way that would be easily usable to a variety of users as a reference and training document, as well as be transparent to our future workers about the decisions that were made and why they were made in this current moment. To be transparent about our workflows and to raise the visibility about all the work that we had been doing because it hadn't been visible before. We also wanted it to be used in conjunction with a variety of other tools. So our accessioning manual, the inventory templates, and then we're working on separately a guide to more inclusive description. So I know that's a long explanation, but it's why.
That was a very good explanation, Lexi. Thank you. So I did ask for additional questions, but we've actually run over time. So Jen has asked a question in the chat specifically of Sarah and Sheridan about integrating ArchivesSpace with Preservica. So maybe if Sarah or Sheridan, if you'd like to answer that in the Q&A. And we actually had a webinar last year on integrating with Preservica. So I'll drop a link to that as well, Jen, for you. Sorry, we can't answer the question live, but we do need to go ahead and move on. But thank you so much to Sarah, Sheridan, and Lexi for that excellent presentation. What a great way to kick off the forum. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead